Hello, my name is Will.
And my name is Ellie.
Welcome to Lively Minds, the podcast about mental health challenges that go beyond the ebb and flow of the everyday.
The podcast that looks at how building a better understanding of our mental health can influence how we address it.
Hello, Ellie.
Hi, Will. We haven't done this for ages.
It has been a while, hasn't it? We did manage to release an episode last month because we had some footage in the bank, as it were, from a previous interview, which was great. But yeah, this is the first time that you and I have spoken for a very long time.
Well, for the podcast, yeah.
For the podcast.
Yeah. Be a bit weird if we just hadn't spoken.
Yes. Yeah. People may be surprised to hear that we do sometimes have conversations that we don't record. Ha 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 ha.
Because we've had a bit of a break in recording new episodes and a lot's gone on. So I don't know if you want to start by just giving a summary of what the hell's been happening.
A lot has been going on, yes. So at the end of November 2025, I discovered that something that I thought was a lingering infection that I'd been told was something called epididymitis, basically a testicular infection, was in fact a very advanced stage testicular cancer. The discovery of this happened in about the space of 36 hours.
Yeah, that is the most bizarre text exchange I think I've ever had with someone. You were like, yeah, just been to an appointment. They think it's just the wrong antibiotic, so just put me on a new one. So, pain's probably getting better, feels good. And then, felt like 20 minutes later, you're just right, so I'm starting chemo now.
That's not far off what actually happened. I started this new antibiotics, as you say. They weren't seeming to do anything whatsoever. So I went in yet again to urology, where I'd been referred to, and thankfully, because I'd been referred to urology, I could skip A&E and go to their emergency admissions unit, where I got seen in the wee hours of the morning by a doctor that I hadn't come across before, who said, and I still remember his exact words, he went, I think we might have to think of an alternative diagnosis. I didn't think anything of that in terms of cancer because I'd been told from the previous ultrasounds that there was no cancer present. But then I went the next morning, I had another ultrasound, I waited all day in the hospital. At the end, a doctor came and told me that I had testicular cancer. At that point, it was thought to be quite early stages. An orchiectomy was thought to be the solution, and I even went down to the office of the anaesthetists to have the full pre-op sort of questionnaire and check and things. And then the next day, I got a phone call from the hospital saying, we need you to come in now to be admitted because actually your tumour markers are sky high. And you're going to have to come in right away to start chemotherapy. And so, that all happened within the space of about 36 hours.
Yeah.
So it was quite a massive shock. So the conversation that I'd be really interested in us having today is just talking through some of the mental health observations I've made in the, 3-4 months that have passed since that 32-hour period, because there's been quite a lot of stuff going on in my mind as much as obviously out there in the real world. And I think, it's obviously important to say at this point that this is just me talking about this based on my experiences, and I realise that there's people out there who will have very different experiences. I'm somebody who, before getting ill with cancer, really had very little issues when it came to physical health problems. Obviously, I've had mental health problems for a very long time, as regular listeners to the podcast will know. So in that sense, I'm conscious that there's people who will have had physical health problems their entire life, and that they'll have their own experiences as well. And so this is really just about me unpacking, I guess, some of the stuff that's happened over the past 3 or 4 months. And I will really welcome your input too, Ellie.
Yeah, no, but I was actually, maybe this is a good time to say that, because I hadn't said it to you before, but one of the reasons I was so worried for you and felt so bad for you was because you haven't had particularly intense long-term health issues, physical body stuff before. That made me feel like what you were going through is even worse, because when I've had a sudden cancer scare and had to go through a cancer clinic or something, at least I'm used to being in hospital. I'm used to having scans show something weird. And psychologically I've had years of therapy about how I relate to my own body when it's not doing what I want it to and all of that. And I just felt so bad for you that you just it's like being thrown into the deep end of just like, yeah, you've now got to physically deal with this, socially deal with it, which is a whole other thing, and like mentally deal with not just what is happening to you and everything, but also just the whole everyday reality of being in hospital, being poorly. It made me feel not worse. Sounds like it would be comparative, like I wouldn't feel as bad as if you'd had health problems before. But I remember thinking about that a lot. I just felt
that's really interesting.
Aware that you were having to do a lot of work in your head in a very intense way.
Yeah, and that's true. I mean, I think it was just the thing that I remember most about, heading into the hospital and sort of sitting there waiting for the consultant to come and see me was shock. I mean, I know that's an obvious thing to say in a way, but the best way of describing it is that I ended up being admitted for a week to have first intensive batch of chemotherapy. For that entire week, I kind of felt like I was actually dreaming. And I know people say that, but I honestly felt like I was going to wake up at some point.
Yeah.
Or that this sounds really weird, but that someone was going to come in and go, haha, surprise! This is not real. This was a test, or this was some kind of weird experiment, or some. I honestly thought that was going to happen. I kept on thinking I was going to pinch myself and wake up. So it was almost like this weird kind of dreamlike state that I found myself in.
Did you feel? Was it like detached from what was going on?
Yeah, I think there was a certain amount of detachment going on, and a certain amount of dissociation. But it was very full on, and I guess what was full on about it was that I had this scan to see how far the cancer had spread. Next day, just before starting the actual chemotherapy, my consultant came and told me that the cancer had spread to the liver, and that meant that I was in the poor/intermediate risk group, which basically means that there's a higher chance of this not working out well. And he said, you've still got about a 70 or 80% chance of it being fine. But of course, all I could think about was the 20 to 30% chance. And I spent that whole week basically thinking I was going to die. I mean, that's what I was just thinking, really.
Yeah.
And looking back on it now, it's easy to kind of be critical of oneself and be thinking, but the surgeon said you're going to have a 70 to 80% chance of living and making a full recovery. But I think that it's difficult to kind of get over the hump of the official prognosis, which literally says poor risk. And also as people sometimes certainly used to call it, the big C, which is that there still is perception that getting cancer is the end of everything for people who receive that terrible, terrible news. I'm putting that in quotes. And so, all of these labels that were being put onto my diagnosis were all pretty scary labels, even though statistically the chances of actually getting through it were quite high.
Until someone's talked to you about your life like that, you haven't gone through every day thinking, today I believe I have a 3% chance of having a terminal illness. Before, today is a 12% and tomorrow is 1%, and it's put into numbers like that.
Yeah.
How are you meant... You had to deal with so much in one go. I'm not surprised you felt like you were in a dream, and it's completely natural, obviously, to be feeling pessimistic and thinking about the 20 to 30% in that context. Were you thinking about things that you hadn't thought about before?
Yes, I found that there were sort of two sides to my mental processing that happened in that week. That was obviously quite often interrupted by lack of sleep, and also I had pretty bad constipation, and I was still using some pain control because, of course, the pain hadn't gone away by this point. The pain I'd been experiencing because of what I thought was this infection turned out to actually be the tumours pressing up against my organs, and that was still happening. Though astonishingly, as a side note, the first round of chemo got rid of that pain because the tumours shrunk back enough to actually stop the pain, which was incredible. But I found that my mental processing was kind of divided into two parts. There was the part which was extremely pessimistic, thinking about death all the time, actually deciding in the end that I just needed to acknowledge the possibility. Yes, there's a possibility that you might die. I had a really interesting conversation with my dad about it, who happens to be a retired Anglican vicar. I'm not religious at all, but we still had a really useful conversation conversation about it. So there was that side of things. And then the other side of things was this, and it's going to sound very cliche to say this, but it was this kind of, if I get through this, I'm going to turn my life around.
Yeah.
I'm going to do so many things differently. I'm going to get healthier and fitter, and I'm going to go for
climb Everest and
go for walks more. I'm going to do more things that are creative, and I'm going to get back into filmmaking, my own personal filmmaking. And that was really quite a serious thing that was going through, and something that, in a sense, kind of gave me the optimism side of things. I think as time has gone on, I've managed to believe that things will get better. I think one of the other ways that I've generally tried to process things is I found that, to start off with, I was trying to very actively do a lot of positive thinking, in inverted commas, trying to always think of the good side of things, and actually also how lucky I was. What I realised was that it was still important to give myself permission just to think how shit things were as well.
Yeah.
And actually maybe I should stop thinking how lucky I am all the time. On some scales, I'm incredibly lucky. You know, my side effects of the chemo weren't as bad as they are for many people. I had somewhere I could stay. I live alone, so I went and stayed with my mum and dad, who were incredible and who looked after me basically for 3 months, which was a whole other strange psychological experience because, as I said to them, it felt very weird. My 72 and 80-year-old parents looking after their 45-year-old son. It just feels like the wrong way around in that kind of way. But at times they were literally looking after me because I was just unable to get out of bed, really. So there's all that stuff that I am very, very lucky about, without a doubt. But also on a different scale, I'm not lucky at all.
No, and well done to you for being able to grasp onto the things that you're grateful for and felt lucky for. But also, it's not always helpful psychologically to do that, because part of it is kind of denying you the reality of the shitness that is like that you're actually living through and in. And we know that it doesn't work when making constant comparisons to others in order to kind of minimize your own problems. You just like suddenly had this awful news to deal with, like what your body was going through as well. You're in the middle of a trauma. You can't process the trauma while it's still happening and you're in the middle of it. And you can't, it's way too much to expect yourself to be able to regulate and reason. That's like a whole other layer of stuff that psychologically you are expecting yourself to do. And actually you need to just be like, oh my God, this is awful. But also, yeah, it is hard because you don't want to indulge. It's too scary to indulge and fully go down a pit, as I guess you know, because that's what it was like at the start. But it's a lot to expect of yourself to be able to self-regulate your emotional response to all this stuff going on. That there's no script, is there? Yeah,
there being no script is an interesting point, actually, because I'm somebody who does require quite a lot of certainty, I guess, very, very often, in terms of just knowing what's going to happen next and knowing what the script is for any given situation. Certainly a lack of that has triggered anxieties in the past. And in this situation, you are being put through a process which you don't fully understand, and that often you don't know what the next step is going to be till you arrive at wherever it is you've been told to go. And then suddenly you're doing the next part of this process. And it's this strange powerlessness where you're just having to just allow yourself to be brought into a system and do what you're told to do, basically.
Whilst all the time you are the one experiencing it. It's your organs and blood system and body and nerve system that is like being probed and drugged and whatever by other people who know more about your organs than you do. Like you said, like there is such a knowledge imbalance.
It leaves you feeling a certain degree of powerlessness, but at the same time, from a mental health point of view, usually my anxiety that I have is anxiety because I feel like I should do something, as in like I worry about something usually work related. And the actual anxiety going through my mind is one of not being able to make a decision or feeling like I can't make a decision about acting on a worry or a concern that I have. And this is very different because I'm going into a situation where I'm having to just basically hand myself over, and the anxiety that I'm feeling is anxiety about stuff that's happening to me by people that, as you know far more about my internal organs than I do. And so there's actually nothing I can do as such, which in one respect is quite liberating, right?
There's not much worrying about what I do next because I have no control.
Yeah, exactly. At the same time, the lack of agency isn't necessarily a good thing either. And I think that a lot of people, especially more regular users of the NHS, would say that a lack of agency from patients and that kind of power imbalance that you've just talked about before is a real problem, because people feel powerless in making decisions about their own health. So I guess that's another balancing act. And I guess the other thing to add to that is that I've debated in my head a risk-benefit analysis, if you like, of on the one hand, buying into that ignorance and that powerlessness and being like, well, in a sense, my powerlessness is because of my ignorance, compared to actually researching what it is that they're doing and finding out as much as I possibly can about what it is that they're doing in terms of my treatment. And I found myself generally, as time has gone on, erring much, much more towards finding out about it and researching it, and doing so in probably a slightly obsessive way, where I've been, fortunately or unfortunately, because it's not always bad, but I've been using AI I've just been blasting the AI with questions. I've got an entire thread of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of prompts long, all about testicular cancer and all of the various things linked to that. And so when I got told by my consultant a couple of weeks ago that I was going to require this thing called RPLND surgery, I already knew that was highly likely because of all the reading that I'd done. And that is the sort of next big hurdle I have to get over, is this big operation that's going to be happening in the next couple of weeks. But part of me thinks, from a mental well-being point of view, would I have been better off not looking into it and then just being a bit floored by that conversation with the consultant? Or would I have been better being prepared, but nevertheless therefore ruminating about it a lot for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks beforehand?
Which do you think?
I think I was better off doing the research. And I'm saying that very cautiously, because I know that can be a really dangerous rabbit hole for people, especially if they have anxiety problems and have this habit of doom scrolling and all the rest of it. Actually, as it happens, I learned about the possibility of this major surgery being needed, not from AI or from internet or Google or anything. I actually found it out from a cancer information booklet. So, I found
one of the approved knowledge tools.
Exactly, an approved knowledge tool told me about it. So I decided quite early on that I was going to try and own it. And interesting, this goes back to our conversation just a few moments ago about self-agency. That actually, by learning about it and by just understanding as much as possible about it as I can, I would be able to take ownership of the possibility of this happening. And then when my consultant told me it was going to be necessary, that I would feel bit more in control, And I think I do feel a bit more in control as a result. But at the same time, as I said before, I'm not sure whether that means that I always looked into RPLND and all the stuff around that in a way that was always healthy. I think that sometimes it went down rabbit holes that shouldn't have, and it caused a lot of anxiety. And also, I'd also say that I totally get that a lot of people in my situation, I wouldn't have the time or the know-how to be able to find out these things about what was going to be happening to them. And so I guess that also begs the question about what information should be getting shared with people at different stages of the process.
I think that is such a huge part of the problem of the kind of power imbalance within the hospital or clinic setting, because understandably a consultant or the professional with so much just the knowledge but the power to act on, to treat or whatever, you can imagine why they wouldn't want to offload loads of knowledge onto you of all these potential things that could happen, because some of them might not happen. And you can see how someone might think that that's a kind thing to do, is to not tell you about all of these potential hypothetical things. But it seems a lot of the time like they've not worked out an in-between. And I don't know how you found it, but I feel like they often forget that you don't know what they know and that you have no context. And it's a bit like, look, if you haven't explained something to me in layman's terms, I probably don't know what you're talking about. And there doesn't seem to be an appropriate amount of effort put into, empowering people with knowledge and understand it. There's such a huge gap that it's either, you have to go down your own rabbit hole, or you just have to listen to what the doctor says and not understand any of it.
And I think that what you said at the beginning about the medics not wanting to bombard you and overwhelm you with information, I do think that is often a reason why information is held back. And when I was first called into the hospital, sitting on my bed waiting to get in it, the consultant arrives and he takes me through everything that's going to happen in terms of the chemo. It's going to be 12 weeks of chemo, 4 times 3-week cycles back to back, each cycle beginning with 5 days of intensive chemo, further chemotherapies on days 8 and 15 of those cycles. For people listening who have experience of testicular cancer, this will sound very familiar. It's called the BEP regime, and it's amongst the most intense chemotherapeutic regimes there are out there. He didn't mention the possibility of RPLND. This is the major surgery I'm now having to have. And I can completely understand why he didn't.
At that stage, yeah. You're introducing a lot of new things to some unsuspecting person already, especially in your scenario. It's so I'm now here and I have advanced cancer and I'm about to start chemo. I can see why you're not thinking you're just trying to prepare them for the next 6 weeks or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. It's information staging. And I guess the question then becomes, at what point, at what stage is further information about what could happen compared to what's definitely going to happen? At what point should those be introduced and explained to the patient in ways that they can understand and that they could potentially have some level of control over?
And I guess the thing is, there isn't really a right answer, because what the answer might be in your case might be completely different for someone else who might actually really prefer not to be given any information that they don't really need for what is immediately happening.
Yeah.
On the grounds that will produce more anxiety.
Yeah.
There is also a limit to how much person-centred decision-making can be made on their part of sharing knowledge, because they've just met you.
And I guess that takes us on to these questions then about the health service. And, I think there's 2 things that I've really noticed from my experience of having been admitted to hospital and also being an outpatient now for several months, which is that, first of all, I'm very conscious. Well, first of all, before we went on air, we were talking about how, and this will be particularly, I guess, interesting for non-UK listeners, is that in the UK, the NHS, it's often considered to be quite a hallowed institution. It's something which gets talked about as being something of huge national pride and something that we should be incredibly proud of. And of course, all those things are absolutely true in my case and still are true following the experiences I've had. At the same time, however, there's absolutely no reason why we can't talk about the NHS in terms of what should be improved, because whilst we can be very grateful for having a public health service or socialised healthcare, as I believe that it gets called in the States, and for the record, that is an incredible thing, and there are incredible people who work in it, there are also lots and lots of problems with it, huge problems with our health service, and that sometimes we can feel reticent about making those sort of comments. I heard once somebody on the radio actually saying something quite funny, I thought. A British radio station, so it was just after Madonna, I think it was, had come on to American radio criticising our NHS, saying it was all old Victorian buildings falling into bits. And Twitter, which was still quite in its early days at that point.
What a bizarre take.
It was it was something along those lines. And Twitter, which was still quite in its early days, broke because so many Brits came on to Twitter defending the NHS. And somebody on the radio said, because the NHS, it's an institution that we, the British, we're allowed to criticise it as much as we bloody well like. But nobody else, the moment anybody else criticises it, we're going to be defending it to the hilt. And I think there's a lot of truth in that.
There's
I think
that
it is that it's ours and it's got many, many faults. But as you said when we were off air, as a concept, as an idea, as a principle, it's great. It's just that in practice, it's got a lot
and
of
I do
issues.
feel quite strongly about this, that there's a very toxic element to the attitude of, no, you can't say anything bad about the NHS, it's so great, we have to be permanently grateful, and da-da-da-da. I'm like, no. Like, that, knowingly or unknowingly, it is used as a political tool to move past the fact that the government is breaking it slowly and painfully in ways that mean it is loads of aspects of it are causing harm and damage to both the people that work in it and patients. And if this like toxic positivity that's associated with the NHS a lot of the time, it also denies people's lived experience and harm. Obviously, I've had some amazing experiences in the NHS, but I've also been treated some of the worst ways that I've ever been treated in the NHS. And to have those experiences, like, oh, you have to be grateful, be like, no, I bloody don't. That was awful. I was not treated like a human. That was completely traumatic. And I think I don't know if you have noticed the difference, but I feel like in recent years, I do hear that denial of anything bad associated to the NHS. I do feel like that's happening less because it's now so broken that people who don't require the NHS for an ongoing condition management or surgery or something are now experiencing it directly not working, with the whole like people not being able to book GP appointments, not having a named GP anymore. You can only book an appointment by going online and there aren't any for 6 weeks, all of that sort of stuff. It could be the best thing in the entire world, and it is as a concept, but I just feel like it's being bludgeoned, and that hurts everyone working in it and everyone relying on it.
So I think the two sort of headline observations I made about my NHS care from a mental health perspective, the first would be it was very noticeable how there was never any conversation about mental health support for processing the receiving a diagnosis of advanced testicular cancer. I assume my experience is typical and that's just not a done thing. Have you ever been offered any kind of counselling support?
Once.
And that was specifically around processing a physical diagnosis?
It was basically once I was offered to be referred to the women's health psychotherapist within the women's health department of a hospital. That's the only time, and having been at many different women's health departments in different hospitals since, it's never happened again. And I think that must have been a fluke because they happen to have an on-site health-focused psychotherapist. But to deal with diagnosis, no. And I've also never had a sort of sudden diagnosis like the one that you had at all. So I found that surprising because whenever I'm in the hospital, like, is it Manchester? One of the ones near me has a whole like room with 2 members of staff in it that's just like support information and services and all these things that you can get if you have cancer. So my perspective, if I had to guess, was that you actually are more likely to be offered some form of mental health support if you're in your position, for example, given a sudden, quite devastating diagnosis.
So I guess just to add a clarification, there was psychological support available, but that was provided entirely by other agencies. So we have a Maggie's Centre, which is the well-known national charity here, cancer charity. Their centre is right next door, and they have trained specialist nurses who also can act as counsellors to people who have just received a cancer diagnosis. There's also the Macmillan Centre within the hospital as well.
But were you offered those?
I was told about
straight
them,
away.
I was told about them. I guess what I find interesting is that there was nothing in-house. There was no kind of NHS provision for psychological support. And I mean, don't get me wrong, it doesn't surprise me at all that there wasn't. In a sense, I wouldn't have necessarily expected there to be, because I know how chronically underfunded mental health is in this country. And obviously the nurses and all the staff on the ward don't have time for mental health support because it takes time and patience and attention. And if you're working on a busy cancer ward and you're
Yeah.
rushing around responding to the various beeping machines, the endless beeping, my
Yeah.
words, then of course there's no time for any of that. And I think it's really important. It's really good that there's services out there like Macmillan and like Maggie's amazing. I do wonder whether, I just wonder, I'm asking the question, is there not a statutory is probably too strong a word, but a role actually within the NHS, which is about saying actually somebody who's on the ward. Because the other challenge, of course, with the outsource is the wrong word as well. The challenge with those kind of support services being offered by Maggie's and by Macmillan is that if you are an inpatient, that's a bit more tricky. If you're an outpatient, that's much easier. If you actually are literally rigged to a machine 24 hours a day, as I was for the first 7 days, the first 6 days, you can't just go off site to look. Even though Maggie's was literally across the road from where I was, you can't go off site.
Just be wandering around.
You can't be wandering around with your machine and your trolley.
Were there any people to visit people on the ward?
There was a visit by the Newcastle Hospitals charity, which is different again.
Yeah.
And they came to talk to me about complementary therapies.
Oh,
So not so much counselling, but more things like reflexology, massage, mindfulness, that sort of thing. And actually, I did take them up on their offer, and I did have a few reflexology sessions, and they were great. They were really great. I'm not into all of the so-called science behind it, if it is even science. I just think it's really relaxing. I mean, it's a no-brainer, isn't it? If someone's going to massage your feet, that's going to be a relaxing experience.
Yeah.
Well,
especially when the rest of your body is like waging war against itself.
Yes.
It's like...
Absolutely. Yeah, completely. The second observation I would make is just one about communication and how important it is in these situations. And I'd be interested to hear from listeners, actually, especially if you live in different countries, what your experience of healthcare information and communication is from your healthcare providers.
You mean like appointment letters and the way that you're like sort of officially told about what's going on?
Exactly, yeah, just how the lines of communication work, because, and this links in directly to what we were talking about before, about the staging of information and about whether receiving information about what could happen or what is happening, what we know is happening, is something which can be overwhelming and something that's better to not have any knowledge of or to be surprised about when it does happen, rather than be told it might happen and ruminate about it in the run-up to finding out for sure. I think there's a lot of work still to do, I think, in the area of how the NHS communicates with its patients. An example would be, I keep on getting told I've got appointments for things, and yet I don't get told what it's for. It's just, you have an appointment at X on Y at this time, be there. And I just thought to myself, just one little bit of a sentence, just one sentence saying, this is to ... would just be really useful in terms of just feeling again like you've got some control over it. Even
if it's just like a generic sentence from their own automated system, but that at least is an extra sentence explaining what clinic exactly it is or why the appointment is happening, like anything.
Yeah, definitely.
And it's so what I find so frustrating is it must waste so much of its own resources, because the amount of times I've have to phone and be like, I've just got this letter, is it a mistake? Or do I have an appointment? Who's it with? What's it for?
Yeah.
I already had an appointment. Do I like the amount of extra admin it must create to not be clear with people. Yeah. And then sometimes, I don't know if you had this, but I've had horrendous problems before with letters not arriving. But then I've also had it where 4 letters have arrived and they say exactly the same thing, but they have a slightly different reference number on the top. And then I'm like, well, do I have 4 appointments or do I just have 1 appointment and the system's had a hiccup? And I don't know.
Notwithstanding the stuff we've already talked about when is information too much information. So, for example, if the letter said this is to ... and the ... was, for example, something that I hadn't known about before that was potentially flagging a new problem that I wasn't even aware of, that could do more harm than good.
Yeah. And again, I can see the logic behind making a decision not to add that type of information in a letter. I can see why you would not do that. But again, why is there just so little attention paid to the in-between that can happen?
Yeah.
Like this appointments with an oncologist to discuss, the results, something just bland, like to discuss your treatment, to discuss the results from whatever it is.
So, I mean, to finish off, there's just a couple of other thoughts I wanted just to mention. I think this has been a really interesting conversation, Ellie. I think that the conversation about balancing trying to be positive mentally with just allowing yourself to not be, and to actually acknowledge how bad a situation is and not having to feel like you have to hide that, particularly from yourself, never mind other people, is a really interesting question. I think for me now, as I'm heading towards this major operation, and it will be a major operation, it's going to be open surgery, I'm going to be under for quite a long time. As we were talking about before we went on air, I've never ever been under before. I've never had general anaesthetic before. And linking into what we were saying before, the way I've found myself dealing with that is to go, it's really scary.
Yeah.
And that's okay.
Yeah.
It's okay that it's really scary, because it is scary.
Yeah, and even though I was saying to you my unhelpful view, which is like, oh yeah, absolutely, love it. Love going under anaesthetic, because I do, weirdly.
Well, of course, our audience weren't there to hear this, but yes, just to confirm, Ellie was waxing lyrical about the joys of general anaesthetic.
Yeah, I was like, oh, I absolutely love it. But I do remember that I was terrified the first few times that I had it, because it's such an unnatural thing to do. It's like, we're going to put you asleep, but you're not really asleep. Like, you're not going to dream. You're just sort of, like you're a robot. It's like, we're just going to turn you off for a bit. And you're like, what?
Yeah.
How is that fine?
Yeah.
That sounds like immensely not fine, but it is.
And then, on the other hand, sort of thinking more positively, I know I was being slightly facetious when I was talking about how I was in that first week and how I balanced the dark thoughts with thoughts of how I was going to transform myself afterwards and live a better life than I had before. I do think there is something in having an attitude of looking at this as a transitional point where I can think about my life differently afterwards. Of course, the extent to which that's possible is dependent upon so many different factors, and also is very dependent upon one's own life circumstances and so many other things. But I think there was some potential in that. And I think overall, being admitted to hospital and it all happening so suddenly was definitely a traumatic experience and a huge shock. I think in my case, I want to be careful to distinguish that from being traumatized, because I think what I don't want to do is define it too much through the lens of trauma in such a way that it has the risk of becoming almost self-fulfilling. And I mean, I realise that this is an entirely separate podcast conversation, actually, because we have touched on trauma quite a few times in previous conversations. But I just feel like, who knows, I guess, what will happen in terms of what my trauma response, if I do have a trauma response, will be. I've heard of people, for example, who've been through similar experiences to me, and they've been fine for like a year, and then suddenly, boom, it just hits them. And so who knows what's going to happen, and that might happen, and that's okay, because what has happened, regardless of how you frame it, is an event with a big capital E. So like very suddenly your life as you know it and your sense of reality and expectations of what you're doing tomorrow, everything was ruptured really violently in one go, and you're then just left with this complete rupture in your existence and way of life, and actually just putting together the materiality of like life, the future, work, health, your body, everything, just trying to just even put that all back together is a massive undertaking. So it is huge, regardless of whether you see it through a trauma lens or not. You've had a massive rupture, and it's a difficult thing. You sort of like coming back to a new reality where you have to sort of interpret things a bit differently. You see things a bit differently now because you've gone through this experience, and you can't take certain things for granted if you did before, all those sorts of things. And that's actually such a huge undertaking that it's okay to not also require yourself to be the good patient, using inverted
quotations, and like come out of such an experience with them kind of, and climb a mountain or whatever other, thing. Like when you said you were going back to work, I was like, oh my God, wow, that's so great. Like that felt huge. I'm assuming it felt huge for you, but
it did, and it felt good to be back. And colleagues and co-directors and all the staff have been extremely understanding and accommodating. And of course, that links in very much with how important it is that when somebody goes through such a physically demanding experience, that other people in their lives, other organisations in their lives can actually think to ask what they can do differently and what they can do to help.
Yeah, and the hard thing of coming back to work is that you've had this massive rupture. No one else has, but they've not had the rupture that you've had. They're carrying on as normal. I don't know if you felt this, but I always feel a bit alienating when I'm first like reintroducing myself to society again after a big health thing, because I'm like, wow, does everyone know that I like see everything completely differently now?
It's a really interesting point. There's something, not necessarily specifically around work, but certainly with the world in general.
Yeah, like socialising.
Yeah, I think I remember when I came out of hospital after the first week, just being in the daylight and in the outside air. I mean, it was right in the middle of the winter, and we had an awful winter this winter. But I definitely found myself feeling detached in some ways.
Yeah, because it's like, well, I've just been bored into this new reality that I have to come to terms with, but no one else is. Yeah. They're just like cracking on. Yeah. Their reality is the same as before I got this news and spent a week in hospital. Then you come out and you're like, what? One
of the weird side effects of that for me has been this, like, almost feeling the need to, like, tell everybody that I meet that I've got cancer.
I do that as well when I have bad health news. It's so weird.
Because if they know, then of course that means it'll reset that reality and everything will be fine. Quite early on, during my second cycle, when I was still not having too many problems with appetite, I went to get a takeaway, and I know the guy that runs a takeaway enough to sort of have a chat with. And of course, as you do, he asked, well, how are you? And I said, oh, I've got cancer.
Well, the day before my surgery, I saw Rufus Wainwright and his husband, like, in a concert, and his husband was outside, and for some reason I went up to his husband and was like, I'm having a hysterectomy tomorrow. And he was like, what? Okay.
Thank you so much for that conversation, Ellie. It's been really interesting. As I said, I'd be really interested in our listeners' reflections on it. And if they want to get in touch, of course, they can do so by emailing us, hello@livelymindspod.com. On that note, apologies to people who have been emailing us and we haven't been getting back. It's just been because of all of the various health things going on between both of us.
Yeah, we are aware we have a backlog. Thank you for listening, and please do tune in again next time for another episode of Lively Minds, the mental health podcast.
Please note that this show does not constitute medical advice and is not a replacement for seeking professional help. You can find signposting to support on our website, livelymindspod.com.
Thank you to Will for sharing his experiences. If you are based in the UK and you or someone you know is going through cancer at the moment, do check out maggies.org. We'll put the link in the show notes. They offer a lot of different types of support for people with cancer and people who love people with cancer.
Make sure that you keep up to date with our shows by subscribing wherever you get your podcasts.
Take care and bye for now.
Bye-bye.